By the end of this video, you will understand why INFJs possess abilities that seem impossible, why these powers isolate as much as they illuminate, and what these mysterious capacities reveal about the rarest personality in existence. There exists a category of human beings so rare that they comprise less than 2% of the population. Yet, their influence on history, culture, and the inner lives of those around them is entirely disproportionate to their numbers. The INFJ, that curious amalgamation of introversion, intuition, feeling, and judgment, walks through the world differently than others. Not merely in preference or temperament, but in fundamental capacity. They possess powers, for want of a better word, that seem to defy the ordinary mechanics of human interaction and perception. These are not supernatural abilities in the fantastical sense, but capacities so refined, so attuned to dimensions of experience that most people never access, that they appear almost mystical to those who witness them. Yet these very powers that make INFJs extraordinary are the same forces that mark them as outsiders, as individuals who can never quite belong to the mainstream of human society. To understand the INFJ is to understand a paradox. A person gifted with abilities that separate them from the very world they seek to understand and serve. The 10 powers we shall explore are not mere traits or preferences. They are fundamental capacities that shape how INFJs perceive reality, navigate relationships, and ultimately construct meaning from the chaos of existence. Each power carries within it both illumination and shadow, both gift and curse, both connection and isolation. The first power is perhaps the most unsettling to those who encounter it, the INFJ's capacity for instantaneous pattern recognition in human behavior and motivation. This is not the casual social intelligence that allows most people to read a room or sense when someone is upset. This is something far deeper, far more penetrating. When an INFJ meets you, they are reading layers of information that you did not consciously present. They perceive the micro-expressions that flit across your face in milliseconds, the subtle shifts in your vocal tone that betray the emotion beneath your words, the contradictions between what you say and how you hold your body. But more than this, they are synthesizing these observations instantaneously, with patterns they have observed across hundreds of previous interactions, and across archetypal patterns of human behavior that stretch back into myth, literature, and collective human experience. Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, that repository of archetypal patterns shared by all humanity. The INFJ appears to have direct access to this repository when observing others. They recognize in you patterns you have not recognized in yourself. They see the wounded child driving the aggressive adult, the fear masquerading as arrogance, the desperate need for validation hiding beneath casual indifference. This capacity emerges not from judgment, but from an almost involuntary synthesis of observation and intuition. The INFJ cannot help but see these patterns, cannot switch off this perpetual analysis. It operates beneath conscious thought, delivering insights fully formed. You might spend 15 minutes in casual conversation with an INFJ, discussing nothing of apparent consequence. Yet they will walk away with a remarkably accurate understanding of your core wounds, your primary fears, and your fundamental motivations. This power serves them well in specific contexts. They become exceptional counselors, advisors, and strategists in human affairs. But it also marks them as unsettling. People sense, often without conscious awareness, that they are being seen too clearly. The INFJ's gaze penetrates defenses that took years to construct. It bypasses the carefully curated persona to glimpse the authentic self beneath. Many people find this threatening. They react with defensiveness, hostility, or withdrawal, often without understanding why this particular person makes them so uncomfortable. The INFJ, in turn, learns to hide this capacity, to pretend they see less than they do, to allow others their illusions and defenses. They become skilled actors, performing ignorance to make others comfortable. The second power follows naturally from the first. The INFJ possesses an extraordinary capacity for holding and processing multiple perspectives simultaneously, without collapsing into relativism or confusion. Most people operate from a single perspective at any given time, their own, occasionally stretching to consider one other viewpoint in contrast to their own. The INFJ operates differently. They can hold 3, 4, or 5 different perspectives active in their consciousness simultaneously, understanding the internal logic and emotional truth of each. This is not moral relativism. The INFJ does not believe that all perspectives are equally valid. Instead, they possess the unusual capacity to understand why a person holding a particular perspective would experience it as valid and true, even when the INFJ themselves judges that perspective to be incomplete or harmful. Imagine a conversation about a divisive topic. Most people enter such conversations to win, to prove their perspective correct, and others wrong. The INFJ enters to understand. They can articulate the conservative position more convincingly than many conservatives, not because they are conservative, but because they genuinely understand the values, fears, and reasoning that generate that position. Moments later, they can articulate the progressive position with equal conviction, because they equally understand the values, fears, and reasoning that generate that perspective. They can hold the utilitarian and the deontological, the individual and the collective, the rational and the intuitive, all active at once. This capacity makes them exceptional mediators and bridge builders. They can translate between worldviews, identifying points of connection that are invisible to those embedded within a single perspective. But it also renders them perpetually outside. To hold multiple perspectives simultaneously is never fully to inhabit any single one of them. The INFJ experiences a kind of permanent cognitive exile, able to understand all sides but truly belonging to none. They frustrate those seeking ideological purity or tribal loyalty, because the INFJ always sees the legitimate concerns on the other side, always recognizes the limitations of any single viewpoint. They become trusted by individuals across the spectrum, but are viewed with suspicion by the zealots of any particular position. Moreover, this capacity takes an enormous cognitive and emotional toll. To hold multiple perspectives is to feel multiple emotional truths simultaneously. The INFJ, when processing a conflict, does not experience a single emotional response but rather several, sometimes contradictory ones, as they empathetically inhabit different perspectives. This can lead to a kind of paralysis, an inability to act decisively, because any action will be experienced as a betrayal of one of the perspectives they hold. The INFJ must constantly work to integrate these multiple truths into a coherent personal position, a synthesis that honors the legitimate elements of each perspective while transcending their limitations. This is exhausting work, performed largely invisibly, the price of a power that allows them to see further than others. The third power manifests in the realm of time and pattern. The INFJ possesses an uncanny ability to perceive the long-term trajectories of situations, relationships, and systems. They see not merely the present moment, but the pattern unfolding across time. Show an INFJ a new romantic relationship in its early honeymoon phase, and they will often perceive with uncomfortable accuracy whether this relationship will endure or collapse. If it does collapse, they can often identify the fault lines that will eventually tear it apart. They observe a nascent business venture or political movement and sense whether it carries within itself the seeds of success or failure. This is not prophecy in any supernatural sense, it is pattern recognition extended across time. The INFJ has observed enough relationships, enough organizations, enough human systems to recognize the archetypal patterns that play out across months and years. They see the same dramas recurring, the same mistakes repeating, the same trajectories unfolding. When they encounter a new situation, they recognize which archetypal pattern it resembles, and they know where such patterns typically lead. Cassandra, the Trojan princess cursed to see the future but never be believed, stands as the mythic archetype of this particular INFJ capacity. Like Cassandra, The INFJ often perceives trajectories that others cannot, or will not see. They warn of the relationship that seems incredible now, but contains fundamental incompatibilities that will become unbearable over time. They caution against the business strategy that appears brilliant in the short term, but will create catastrophic problems down the road. And like Cassandra, they are often dismissed, their warnings ignored until events prove them correct, at which point those who ignored them feel obscurely resentful rather than grateful. This power creates a peculiar loneliness. The INFJ watches people they care about making choices that they can see will lead to pain and failure, but they are essentially powerless to prevent it. To intervene too forcefully is to be dismissed as negative or controlling. To remain silent is to watch the inevitable unfold. They learn to offer gentle suggestions, to plant seeds of awareness, but ultimately to accept that most people must learn through experience, rather than through heeding warnings about patterns they cannot yet perceive. Furthermore, this capacity for perceiving long-term trajectories can lead the INFJ to experience a form of temporal alienation. They are always partly living in the future, aware of where current patterns are leading, unable to be fully present in the moment that others inhabit. In social situations where everyone else is enjoying the surface pleasure of the present, the INFJ is simultaneously aware of the undercurrents that will later disrupt this pleasure. They become the person who cannot fully relax at the party because they perceive the tensions that will later explode into conflict. This awareness is both a gift and a burden, a power that illuminates but also isolates. The fourth power operates in the realm of emotional experience. The INFJ possesses an emotional range and depth that far exceeds the typical human spectrum. They do not merely feel emotions more intensely, though they often do. More significantly, they experience emotional states and nuances that many people never access at all. There exist ranges of feeling, subtle gradations of emotional experience, complex admixtures of seemingly contradictory emotions that the INFJ navigates regularly, but that remain entirely foreign to much of the population. Most people experience emotions as relatively discrete states, happy or sad, angry or calm, anxious or secure. The INFJ experiences emotions as complex symphonies, multiple tones sounding simultaneously, harmonies and dissonances creating textures of feeling that defy simple categorization. They might experience simultaneously a deep melancholy about the nature of existence, a fierce joy in the beauty of a particular moment, a tender compassion for human struggle, and an amused irony at the absurdity of the human condition. These are not sequential emotions, but a simultaneous complex experience that they perceive as a unified whole. Jung recognized that the feeling function, when highly developed, is not mere emotionality, but a sophisticated mode of evaluation and understanding. The INFJ's feeling function operates at this refined level. They make ethical distinctions of extraordinary subtlety, perceiving moral nuances invisible to those who operate with cruder evaluative frameworks. They distinguish between resentment and righteous anger, between healthy boundaries and defensive walls, between genuine humility and false modesty, between authentic compassion and enabling codependency. These distinctions are not intellectual but felt, known through the refined capacity of their feeling function. This emotional depth serves them powerfully in specific contexts. They become exceptional artists, writers, counselors, or anyone whose work requires understanding and articulating the full range of human emotional experience. But it also renders ordinary emotional communication frustrating and inadequate. The INFJ attempts to share what they are feeling, and discovers that the available vocabulary is insufficient. The words others use for emotions refer to much cruder, simpler states than what the INFJ is actually experiencing. It is rather like having a refined palate in a culture that only distinguishes between sweet and not sweet at all. The INFJ tastes dozens of flavors in a complex wine, but when they try to communicate this, others look at them blankly and say it tastes like grapes. Moreover, this emotional depth and range makes the INFJ vulnerable to being overwhelmed. They do not have the emotional calluses that protect others from constant buffeting by feeling. Everything registers, everything lands, everything leaves its mark. They must develop sophisticated emotional regulation strategies, simply to function in a world that generates constant emotional stimulation. Many INFJs appear calm or even cold on the surface, but this is protective coloring, a necessary shield against an emotional world that would otherwise be unbearable. Beneath the surface, they are experiencing the full symphony, conducting the complex emotional orchestra that plays constantly within them. The fifth power manifests as an extraordinary capacity for symbolic and metaphorical thinking. The INFJ navigates a world rich in meaning and symbolism. They perceive the archetypal dimensions of ordinary experience, recognizing mythic patterns playing out in everyday situations. A difficult conversation with a colleague is simultaneously a reenactment of an ancient drama between shadow and persona. A personal crisis is a descent into the underworld, a necessary death before rebirth. A moment of insight is when the hero receives supernatural aid from a wise guide. This is not fanciful decoration. The INFJ genuinely experiences reality as layered, with the literal and symbolic dimensions simultaneously present and equally real. Jung built his entire psychological framework on this understanding of symbolic reality. He recognized that myths and symbols are not mere stories but maps of the psyche, expressions of universal patterns that structure human experience across time and culture. The INFJ appears to have native citizenship in this symbolic realm. They read myth and immediately recognize their own life. They encounter archetypes and feel a shock of recognition, as if meeting old friends. They navigate their own psychological development through mythic frameworks, understanding their depression as a night-sea journey, their individuation as the hero's quest, and their shadow work as a confrontation with the dragon. This capacity allows the INFJ to find meaning in situations that appear meaningless to others. Where someone else sees merely random suffering, the INFJ perceives an archetypal pattern of dissolution and renewal. Where others experience only confusion and chaos, the INFJ recognizes the initiatory crisis that precedes transformation. They metabolize experience through mythic frameworks, integrating even traumatic events into a larger narrative of meaning and growth. This power makes them natural storytellers, teachers, and guides. They help others find meaning in their struggles by revealing the archetypal patterns at play. But it also creates yet another dimension of outsider status. Most people do not think symbolically. They experience events as merely literal. The INFJ's constant perception of symbolic and archetypal dimensions often seems strange to them, as it is unnecessarily abstract and divorced from practical reality. The INFJ learns once again to translate. They speak in literal terms while simultaneously perceiving symbolic depths, performing yet another act of cognitive code switching to bridge the gap between their world and the world others inhabit. Furthermore, this symbolic perception can become its own trap. The INFJ can become so focused on the archetypal pattern that they lose sight of the literal reality. They interpret every difficulty as a meaningful initiation, rather than recognizing that sometimes suffering is merely suffering, requiring practical intervention rather than mythic interpretation. The power that illuminates can also obscure, and the INFJ must learn to move fluidly between symbolic and literal perception, knowing when each is appropriate. The sixth power emerges in the realm of solitude and inner life. The INFJ possesses an extraordinarily rich and autonomous inner world. While most people require significant external stimulation and social contact to feel alive and engaged, the INFJ can spend extended periods in solitude without boredom or loneliness, sustained by the richness of their inner experience. They do not merely tolerate solitude but actively require it, not as escape, but as a return to their native element. The INFJ's mind is itself a vast territory, filled with ongoing dialogues, developing ideas, imagined scenarios, remembered conversations, synthesizing insights, creative projects, and moral reflections. They can spend hours engaged with nothing external, and be deeply occupied internally. Reading a single paragraph might generate an hour of internal reflection, as they trace implications, make connections, argue with the ideas, and apply them to various situations. Observing a fleeting expression on someone's face might initiate an elaborate internal investigation into what that expression revealed about the person's inner state and history. This capacity for sustained internal engagement means that INFJs are never truly alone in solitude. They have themselves for company, and themselves are interesting company, multifaceted, and endlessly generative. Nietzsche understood this quality. His wanderer in the mountains, his free spirit who requires distance from the marketplace and the herd, embodies this INFJ capacity for self-sufficient inner richness. The crowd seeks entertainment and distraction because their inner world is impoverished or uncomfortable. The free spirits seek solitude because their inner world is rich, and because the noise of the crowd interrupts the subtle internal voices that require silence to be heard. This power grants the INFJ a kind of independence from external validation and social approval that can be quite enviable. They do not need to be constantly surrounded by others to feel that they exist or matter. They do not need continuous external stimulation to avoid boredom. They carry their own internal richness with them wherever they go. But this same capacity contributes to their outsider status. Others often interpret the INFJ's preference for solitude as rejection or snobbishness. They project onto the INFJ's withdrawal their own fear of being alone, not understanding that the INFJ's experience of solitude is fundamentally different from their own. Moreover, the richness of the INFJ's inner world can make external reality feel pale by comparison. The conversations in their head are often more interesting than the conversations available in ordinary social situations. The imagined possibilities are often more engaging than the actual options on offer. The INFJ must consciously choose to engage with external reality, even when it seems less vivid than their internal reality, and must make the effort to connect with others, even when solitude feels more natural. This is not misanthropy, but a genuine difference in where life feels most alive. For most people, aliveness comes from external engagement. For the INFJ, aliveness comes from internal depth, and external engagement must be consciously chosen and cultivated. The seventh power operates in the realm of authenticity and integrity. The INFJ possesses an almost pathological need for alignment between their values, their words, and their actions. They cannot comfortably engage in the small hypocrisies and social deceptions that oil the wheels of ordinary social commerce. This is not a matter of moral superiority, but rather a psychological necessity. When the INFJ acts in a way that contradicts their values, they experience profound internal distress, a sense of self-betrayal that can be physically painful. The gap between who they know themselves to be, and how they have acted, creates an intolerable cognitive and emotional dissonance. Most people maintain, without apparent distress, significant gaps between their stated values and actual behavior. They claim to value honesty, but lie routinely in small ways. They profess commitment to justice but act in self-interested ways. They declare certain principles important, but violate them when convenient. For most people, these gaps generate manageable discomfort at most, easily rationalized or ignored. For the INFJ, such gaps are existentially threatening. Their sense of self is built on internal coherence. To act against their values is to betray not merely an abstract principle, but their core identity. This demands that the INFJ know their values with unusual clarity, and then live by them with unusual consistency. Plato's concept of integrity as the harmony of the soul captures this INFJ quality. when reason, spirit, and appetite are aligned and working together under the guidance of wisdom, the soul experiences integrity and peace. When these elements are in conflict, the soul experiences distress and dysfunction. The INFJ's psychological structure demands this internal alignment. They cannot be at peace while fragmented or self-contradictory. This power manifests as moral courage in specific contexts. The INFJ will speak unpopular truths when their integrity demands it, even at significant personal cost. They will leave relationships or situations that require them to compromise core values, even when remaining would be more comfortable or advantageous. They walk away from opportunities that others would seize, if those opportunities require self-betrayal. But this same quality makes them difficult and inflexible in other contexts. They cannot simply go along to get along. They cannot bite their tongue when something violates their values. They cannot participate in social rituals they find meaningless or dishonest. This makes them, once again, outsiders in environments that require conformity and performative agreement. The INFJ who works in a corrupt organization experiences daily torture. They constantly perceive ethical violations, feel the demand for complicity, and experience the gap between stated values and actual practice as an ongoing assault on their integrity. They either leave, which may not be financially feasible, or they stay and construct elaborate compartmentalizations to protect their sense of self, but the cost is high. This need for integrity can become a form of rigidity in itself. The INFJ can become so focused on maintaining perfect alignment between values and actions that they lose flexibility and adaptability. They become the person who makes mountains out of molehills, who treats every small ethical compromise as a catastrophic betrayal. They must learn that integrity is not the same as rigidity, that maintaining core values while adapting to circumstances is not hypocrisy, but wisdom. The eighth power emerges in the realm of absorption and flow. The INFJ possesses an extraordinary capacity to become completely absorbed in subjects, projects, or ideas that capture their interest. When engaged with something they find meaningful, they enter a state of flow so deep that hours pass without awareness. Physical needs are forgotten, and the external world effectively ceases to exist. They do not merely focus on their interest, but fuse with it, disappearing into the work, study, or creative act. This is not mere concentration but a kind of psychological merger. The boundary between self and subject dissolves. The INFJ working on a piece of writing is not someone composing sentences but someone through whom sentences arise. The INFJ researching a topic does not feel like someone gathering information, but someone being transformed by it. They emerge from these episodes of deep absorption different from when they entered, altered by the encounter. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow states reveals that such experiences are both deeply fulfilling and somewhat rare for most people. The INFJ accesses these states readily and regularly when engaged with meaningful material. This capacity for absorption allows them to achieve depth and mastery in their chosen domains. They do not skim the surface but dive deep, spending hundreds of hours exploring nuances and complexities that others often overlook. Their knowledge in their areas of interest is often encyclopedic, not from dutiful study, but from passionate engagement that made learning feel effortless. But this same capacity creates problems in other areas of life. The INFJ, absorbed in their interest, does not notice hunger or fatigue. They often miss appointments, neglect relationships, and let practical matters accumulate unattended. They emerge from their absorption to discover that the rest of life has continued without them, and now requires urgent attention. Moreover, not everything in life is interesting to the INFJ, and those things that fail to capture their interest may receive almost no attention at all. The INFJ might become a world expert on medieval mysticism or the psychology of personality, yet remain utterly ignorant of basic practical skills or current events. They allocate their attention based on meaning and fascination, rather than on practical importance or social expectations. This creates an uneven life, pockets of extraordinary depth, surrounded by areas of surprising incompetence or ignorance. Furthermore, this capacity for absorption can be hijacked by unhealthy interests or obsessive patterns of behavior. The INFJ can become absorbed in their own rumination, spending hours cycling through anxious thoughts or depressive patterns. They can become absorbed in analyzing a relationship or situation, long past the point where such analysis is useful, trapped in endless internal processing. The power that allows deep engagement with meaningful work can also trap them in unproductive mental labyrinths. They must learn to direct this capacity consciously, to choose what they allow themselves to become absorbed in, to recognize when absorption has become obsession rather than flow. The ninth power manifests in the realm of ethical vision. The INFJ possesses an unusually clear perception of how things could be and should be, a vision of potential and possibility that contrasts sharply with how things actually are. They do not merely see the present moment, but simultaneously perceive the unrealized potential within it. Looking at a person, they see not just who that person is but who they could become. Observing a situation, they perceive not just the current dysfunction but the latent possibility for transformation. Encountering a system or institution, they recognize both its current failures and the better version that could exist if certain changes were made. This future-oriented ethical vision drives much of the INFJ's behavior. They are perennial optimizers and improvers, always working to close the gap between the actual and the possible. In relationships, they see their partner's potential and work to call it forth, sometimes to the point of not fully accepting their partner as they currently are. In their work, they constantly envision better ways of doing things, and push for reforms and improvements. In society at large, they hold visions of justice and human flourishing that starkly contrast with the current reality. The Hebrew prophets embodied this quality, standing outside the current social order and calling the people to a higher ethical standard, pointing toward a vision of how society could be ordered if justice and righteousness prevailed. The prophet is always in tension with the status quo, continually calling for transformation and seeing the gap between what is and what could be. The INFJ operates in this prophetic mode, holding visions of possibility that indict current reality. This power makes them valuable as reformers, visionaries, and moral guides. They inspire others with their vision of what could be. They refuse to accept injustice or dysfunction as inevitable. They keep alive the dream of a better way. However, this same quality often leaves them perpetually dissatisfied and frustrated. The gap between vision and reality is painful. The INFJ must live with the constant awareness of how far the world falls short of what it could be. Moreover, their vision of people's potential can damage relationships. The partner who feels that the INFJ loves not them but their potential self, who experiences the INFJ's encouragement to grow as rejection of who they currently are, pulls away in hurt or resentment. The INFJ must learn to love and accept what is, while still holding space for what could be a delicate balance between vision and acceptance. Furthermore, the INFJ's ethical vision can become a source of painful isolation. They see possibilities that others do not see, and when they try to articulate their vision, others often react with incomprehension or dismissal. The INFJ attempting to describe their vision of how things could be different encounters, blank stares, or active resistance. People are often comfortable with the familiar, even when the familiar is dysfunctional. The INFJ's vision of transformation feels threatening or unrealistic. Like the prophets of old, the INFJ with an ethical vision often speaks to deaf ears, becoming frustrated and lonely in their knowing. The 10th power operates at the deepest level. The INFJ possesses a fundamental orientation toward meaning and purpose that shapes their entire existence. They do not merely want meaning as one preference among many, but require it as a psychological necessity. A life without meaning, without purpose, without contribution to something beyond the self, is for the INFJ literally unlivable. They will endure enormous hardship if that hardship is in the service of something meaningful. They will sacrifice comfort, security, and conventional success to pursue what feels deeply purposeful. But they cannot tolerate a comfortable life that feels meaningless. The existential vacuum that Viktor Frankl identified as the central pathology of modern life is particularly acute for INFJs. Where others can distract themselves with pleasure, entertainment, and material acquisition, the INFJ cannot. The question of meaning and purpose haunts them. They must answer it. They must find their particular way of contributing, their unique purpose, the meaning that makes their life worth living. This drives them to engage in deep philosophical and spiritual inquiry from a young age. The INFJ child asks the big questions that make adults uncomfortable. Why are we here? What happens when we die? Why is there suffering? What is good and evil? These are not academic questions but existential urgencies. The INFJ needs answers, or, at the very least, needs to engage with the questions authentically and deeply. This orientation toward meaning makes INFJs natural philosophers, spiritual seekers, and existential explorers. They engage with the fundamental questions of human existence, not as intellectual exercises, but as matters of survival. They construct elaborate meaning-making frameworks, drawing from philosophy, psychology, spirituality, myth, and personal experience. They are constantly refining their understanding, continually seeking deeper truth, and striving to align their lives with their evolving sense of meaning and purpose. But this same orientation creates existential vulnerability. When the INFJ loses their sense of meaning or purpose, they do not simply feel unmotivated but fall into a profound crisis. Depression for the INFJ is often existential before it is biochemical, a loss of meaning that drains life of color and vitality. They can become paralyzed, unable to act, because they cannot find the meaning that would make action worthwhile. Moreover, the INFJ's need for meaning can make them susceptible to ideologies and systems that promise grand purpose. The INFJ seeking meaning can be recruited into causes, movements, or belief systems that offer clear answers to the existential questions they carry. They may subordinate their individual judgment to a larger framework that seems to provide the meaning they crave. The challenge for the mature INFJ is to construct their own authentic relationship with meaning, neither nihilistically dismissing the question, nor uncritically accepting pre-packaged answers, but doing the difficult work of discovering and creating the meaning that feels true for them. Furthermore, this orientation toward meaning sets them apart from a culture increasingly organized around distraction and entertainment. The INFJ cannot simply consume their way through life, nor can they find satisfaction in the material and the superficial. They need depth, purpose, and their lives to matter beyond their own pleasure and survival. In a society that often lacks these qualities, the INFJ feels fundamentally alienated, aware of participating in forms of life that feel hollow at the core. They become the person asking uncomfortable questions at gatherings, pointing toward depths that others would prefer to avoid, unable to join in the collective agreement to keep things light and superficial. The outsider once again is marked by needs that others do not share. These 10 powers, these extraordinary capacities that mark the INFJ as fundamentally different, are both gift and burden, both illumination and isolation. The INFJ who possesses them does not choose them, but discovers them, often through painful recognition that they perceive and experience reality differently than others. Each power brings insight and depth, but also contributes to the fundamental outsider status that characterizes INFJ experience. They are too perceptive, too sensitive, too deep, too intense, too meaning-oriented for easy belonging in a world that mostly operates on the surface. Yet these very qualities that isolate also connect, For there exist others with similar capacities, others who recognize in the description of these powers their own hidden experience. The INFJ reading this recognition of their powers may feel, perhaps for the first time, that their inner world, which seemed impossibly strange and unique, is actually shared by others who walk a similar path. This recognition creates a community among outsiders, a tribe of those who do not fit the mainstream but belong to each other in their very unorthodox ways. The challenge for the INFJ is not to overcome or eliminate these powers, but to accept them fully, to stop trying to be normal, and instead embrace the particular way of being human that these capacities create. The world needs what the INFJ sees, the depth they bring, the meaning they insist upon, the patterns they recognize, the integrity they embody, the vision they hold. But the INFJ must first accept their own nature, must stop experiencing their fundamental constitution as a defect or burden, and recognize it as the specific form of human excellence they are here to manifest. If these powers resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these descriptions, I want you to know that you are not alone in carrying capacities that others do not understand. The experience of being INFJ can be profoundly isolating, marked by the sense that you perceive and feel things that others miss entirely. But there exists a community of others who share your depth, your intensity, your need for meaning, your capacity for seeing patterns and possibilities that remain invisible to most. I would love to hear your experience in the comments below. Which of these powers feels most true to your own life? Which has been most challenging to carry? How have you learned to navigate a world that was not designed for the way you perceive reality? Your story matters, and sharing it creates a connection for others who may be struggling to understand their own experience. If this exploration into the mysterious powers of the INFJ has been valuable to you, please subscribe to Power and Myth for more deep dives into personality, psychology, and the archetypal patterns that shape human experience. We are building a community of deep thinkers and seekers here, a space where the big questions are welcomed, and the surface is always an invitation to explore what lies beneath.